A terrifying reality, concealed for more than 100 years by local officials, is hidden deep within the isolated hills of eastern Oregon, shrouded in decades of institutional secrecy. During the years 1852 to 1888, over 800 settlers disappeared on a particular 20-mile segment of the Oregon Trail. Their fates were sealed not by illness or misfortune, but by a much darker force. What appeared to be a humble wooden church, the Sacred Heart Chapel, which offered salvation to ailing travelers, was, in reality, the very heart of the most systematic mass murder plot in the history of the American frontier. What started as sporadic disappearances evolved into a family business that was so methodical and brutally effective that it created a new definition of evil. Killing for the Grayson family was not simply for financial gain. They elevated it to a meticulous craft. They maintained detailed ledgers for every life they extinguished, each family they annihilated, and all the dreams they interred in unmarked graves. I must ask you for something before we delve into the evil that overtook the Grayson family and those they victimized. This channel is not suitable for everyone. It is intended only for individuals courageous enough to face the most unsettling truths concealed in America's history. If you are among the minority who can bear these grim accounts, please subscribe immediately and post a comment mentioning the state from which you are tuning in. Your engagement enables us to bring to light the narratives that others are too afraid to share. Let us now travel back to 1852, a time when the Oregon Trail offered the promise of hope but ultimately brought forth terror. A beacon of hope in the wilderness. The Oregon Trail extended like a vital artery across the American frontier, guiding westward aspirations through 2,000 miles of harsh, untamed land. For the countless families that liquidated all their assets for a shot at a better existence, every mile was a symbol of both promise and danger. Sickness, famine, and calamities of nature took innumerable lives. However, in the undulating landscape of eastern Oregon, mortality presented a different guise, one that offered a smile of Christian kindness while secretly assessing the worth of a family's worldly goods. The year 1852 represented the zenith of migration on the Oregon Trail, as more than 50,000 individuals undertook the perilous westward trek. By the time the majority of wagon parties arrived at Oregon's Blue Mountains, their journey had already spanned close to 1,800 miles. The families were depleted of energy, their provisions were dwindling, and their most vulnerable members were frequently falling prey to trail fever, dysentery, and other sicknesses that transformed ambitions of wealth into frantic battles for mere existence. It was within this setting of extreme vulnerability that Father Morai Grayson founded the Sacred Heart Chapel in the year 1851. The time-worn wooden building was situated atop a hill that afforded a view of a common rest area along the trail, a spot where exhausted migrants would frequently stop to give their oxen a break and to inter their deceased. For the pioneers passing by, the chapel signified divine intervention, a glimmer of hope in the vast wilderness where they could find spiritual solace and, if necessary, a formal Christian interment for their departed family members. Father Morai, a lanky, haggard man in his 40s with sharp gray eyes and an authoritative voice, had shown up in Oregon territory asserting he was an itinerant missionary. He spoke with great eloquence of his mission to attend to the spiritual welfare of families heading west, and his command of the scriptures appeared authentic enough to persuade even the most doubt. Full of travelers, at his side was his loyal wife who adopted the name Sister Constance, a woman whose serene disposition and seeming expertise in medicine made her indispensable to families contending with ill children and expiring relatives. The trio, destined to become linked with both deliverance and eternal punishment, was completed by Brother Ezekiel, Morai's younger brother. While Morai had the commanding air of a born leader, Ezekiel was the pragmatic one, adept with tools, well-versed in matters of livestock, and perpetually prepared to assist struggling families with wagon repairs or animal care. The three of them together projected an image of Christian benevolence that irresistibly attracted desperate families. The chapel itself, constructed from local wood, was unpretentious yet impeccably kept, with a small graveyard located next to the main edifice. Inside, simple pews made of rough-cut wood were arranged before a plain altar decorated with a wooden cross that Morai asserted he had carved with his own hands. The most notable characteristic of the structure was its exceptionally large basement, which the Graysons claimed was for the essential storage of provisions they maintained to aid impoverished travelers. The local population was thin, consisting of just a few widely separated homesteads and a minor trading outpost situated about 15 miles to the east. This seclusion greatly benefited the Graysons because it resulted in fewer potential witnesses to their dealings and a reduced likelihood of external meddling. Settlers in the area who had met the family typically had positive things to say about them, lauding their charity and religious piety. After all, who would commit their existence to caring for dying strangers in such a remote location? The Graysons' particular effectiveness stemmed from their grasp of the trail's harsh conditions. They were aware that by the time families got to their chapel, a great number would be contending with severe sickness, diminishing food stores, and the mental fatigue born from months of struggle. They presented themselves as the solution to these hardships, not merely as spiritual advisors, but as down-to-earth assistants capable of offering medical attention, provisions, and even brief lodging for families too frail to press on right away. The specific Christian denomination of a family rarely seemed to be an issue for those in desperate straits. The Graysons would modify their methods accordingly, regardless of whether a family was Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian, or of another Protestant belief. Morai was deeply familiar with a range of Protestant doctrines and could recite scripture in the manner that would most effectively console his listeners. Such adaptability was essential on the frontier, where theological distinctions frequently became secondary to the basic need for survival. On September 23, 1852, the initial disappearance was officially noted. Although it would be decades before investigators could reconstruct the sequence of events, the Morrison family, comprising James, his expectant wife Elizabeth, their 3 small children, and Elizabeth's aged father, had been part of a wagon party that broke up upon entering the Oregon Territory. In a manner similar to many other families, they chose to continue alone toward their ultimate goal, feeling sure they could manage the last stretch of the journey without the security of a bigger party. It felt like an act of God when the Morrisons' wagon suffered a broken axle only 2 miles away from the Sacred Heart Chapel. In later territorial documents, James Morrison was cited as having said that the chapel looked like a divine offering when he first saw it from the crest where his wagon had failed. Within a few hours of the mishap, Brother Ezekiel, who possessed a remar, cable talent for showing up precisely when travelers were most in need, came to the site of the broken wagon. "Brother," began Ezekiel, using the slow, deliberate speech that would define him, "Providence has guided you to our simple chapel for a purpose. Your Elizabeth seems about to give birth any day, and Sister Constance has assisted in many deliveries. It would be Father Morai's privilege to offer you refuge as you fix your wagon and await the blessed event." The Morrison family thankfully took the offer, settling into a small cabin near the chapel that the Graysons kept ready for just these situations. For the next 3 days, life seemed completely ordinary. Elizabeth received gentle care from Sister Constance. James got help from Brother Ezekiel with the wagon's repairs, while Father Morai gave the worried family spiritual reassurance. The children enjoyed themselves in the chapel's yard as Elizabeth's father, Samuel, found relief for his arthritic joints in the cabin's cozy rocking chair. Things started to take a different turn on the 4th day. The first to become unwell was Elizabeth's father, who reported intense stomach pains and feelings of sickness. Sister Constance diagnosed it as trail sickness, a general diagnosis for the assortment of diseases affecting travelers, and started giving him her so-called blessed remedies, which she mixed from herbs and various substances stored in the chapel's lower level. "Nature's gifts are how the Lord provides recovery," she would state as she prepared her mixtures. However, the body sometimes needs to expel its impurities for the healing to commence. Samuel's health declined precipitously within a few hours of consuming Sister Constance's concoction. His complexion turned a pale, grayish color. He struggled to breathe and suffered from severe bouts of vomiting and diarrhea. An increasingly worried James Morrison inquired if they ought to go for assistance at the trading post located to the east. Father Morai, however, advised him to be patient. "Brother James," the minister stated, laying a comforting hand on the younger man's shoulder, "I've encountered this illness frequently along the trail. It needs to follow its natural progression. To move Samuel at this point would undoubtedly be fatal. We have to rely on the Lord's will and the healing abilities of Sister Constance." By the 6th day, young Tommy Morrison, aged 7, started exhibiting comparable symptoms, followed by his 5-year-old sister Mary. Sister Constance toiled ceaselessly, brewing additional remedies, giving what she termed purifying treatments, and maintaining a watch over the progressively ailing family members. To James and Elizabeth, who were still in good health but weary from looking after their relatives, the woman appeared to be a divine messenger sent to guide them through their ordeal. The reality was considerably more malevolent. The sacred concoctions that Sister Constance so devotedly dispensed were laced with precise amounts of arsenic, a substance the Graysons had learned could be acquired from nearby mining companies by claiming it was for vermin extermination. The effects, stomach pains, queasiness, skin-changing color, and ultimately the shutdown of organs, were a perfect imitation of the symptoms of several trail-related illnesses. This made the killings almost impossible for grieving relatives to recognize, especially since they had already seen so much death and hardship on their westward journey. On the 7th day, Samuel Morrison passed away, with Tommy following on the 9th and Mary on the 11th. Each death was marked by extensive Christian ceremonies conducted by Father Morai, who spoke with deep emotion about the deceased being reunited with their Creator and achieving peace after their worldly trials. The surviving members of the family, overwhelmed by sorrow but appreciative of the Graysons' spiritual comfort, did not once doubt the quick series of deaths. It was, after all, not uncommon for whole families to be wiped out by illness on the trail. What they were unaware of was that every night, once the mourning survivors had cried and prayed themselves to sleep, Brother Ezekiel would methodically go through the family's belongings, creating thorough lists of all valuable items. The Morrisons had been quite well off in Missouri, and their wagon held elegant furniture, high-grade tools, inherited treasures, and a significant quantity of gold coins that James had concealed in hidden compartments of his attire. James Morrison himself started showing the unmistakable signs of the illness on the 12th day. Elizabeth, now in the initial phases of childbirth and frantic at the thought of losing her husband in addition to her children and father, pleaded with Sister Constance to make every effort to save him. The response from the woman would, in time, be recalled as exceptionally cold by those who later brought the truth to light. "My dear girl," Sister Constance uttered, grasping Elizabeth's quivering hands, "certain sicknesses are the Lord's method of summoning His flock. His judgment is not for us to challenge. We can only have faith in His compassion. Your husband will be reunited with your beloved infants in heaven, and you shall bring up your newborn with the assurance that your family is waiting for you in the hereafter." On the 14th day, James Morrison passed away, only a few hours before Elizabeth delivered a baby boy who would survive just long enough for Father Morai to baptize him. 3 days later, when Elizabeth also fell victim to the same enigmatic sickness, the whole Morrison family had been eliminated in under 3 weeks. The Graysons had a completely plausible story for any outsider who might have asked about the family's outcome. They would say the Morrisons came to them sick and worn out from their journey, that they had caught a severe strain of dysentery which could sometimes affect entire households, and that they had passed away despite the diligent efforts of their Christian caretakers who had endangered their own health to offer solace in their last moments. Father Morai had provided them with a formal Christian interment in the chapel's graveyard, and their worldly goods had been devoted to the Lord's service, a sanctimonious way of saying they had been stolen. The vanishing of the Morrison family, however, was just the start. The Graysons had stumbled upon a realization that would alter their existence and cast a shadow of fear over the Oregon Trail for the subsequent 36 years. They found that murder, if carried out with enough forethought and a religious pretext, could be immensely lucrative. Perfecting the method. The Graysons gained crucial insights from the successful extermination of their first family, which would influence their tactics for years to follow. They realized that families traveling alone were more vulnerable targets than those in larger parties, that the slow manifestation of arsenic poisoning was indistinguishable from typical trail sicknesses, and that their position of religious authority lent them nearly boundless believability with distraught, mourning individuals who sought a cause for their sorrow other than divine will. Above all, they came to understand that the Oregon Trail offered a never-ending stream of victims who, if they disappeared, might not be reported missing for months or perhaps ever. In contrast to established towns where a person's absence would be promptly noted and looked into, the trail was populated by nomadic families whose precise locations were not known to their relatives in the East. A family that went missing in Oregon might not have been anticipated to get in touch with their kin for half a year or longer. And even if they were, the numerous dangers of frontier existence offered a host of credible reasons for their lack of communication. In the months after the Morrison killings, the Graysons honed their criminal activities. They systematically developed routines and methods that would prove highly effective over the ensuing years. Brother Ezekiel took on the role of their scout, patrolling the pathways leading to the trail to spot suitable targets. Families of clear affluence, those journeying by themselves or in small clusters, and particularly those already contending with sickness or wagon trouble, which made them susceptible to offers of aid. Sister Constance refined her poisoning methods, trying out various amounts and ways of administering the poison to get the best results while still being able to plausibly deny any wrongdoing. She found that arsenic was easy to hide in herbal infusions, medicinal potions, and even the wine used for communion, which simplified the process of giving it to whole families under the pretense of providing spiritual or health-related assistance. Meanwhile, Father Morai mastered the art of psychological persuasion, ensuring victims remained cooperative even as their relatives were dying around them. He grew skilled at discerning people's religious affiliations and tailoring his spiritual message to match. With Methodist families, he stressed the concepts of divine healing and the effectiveness of prayer. In the case of Presbyterians, his focus was on the doctrine of predestination and the ultimate design of God. For Baptists, he highlighted individual salvation and the assurance of a reunion in heaven. The chapel itself was subtly altered to facilitate their homicidal business. The basement was made larger and partitioned. One section was for keeping the victims' belongings, another for mixing arsenic concoctions, and a third acted as a makeshift morgue for holding bodies until the Graysons could decide how to dispose of them. They also prepared a number of unmarked burial spots in a cluster of trees at the back of the chapel, places that would later contain the bodies of hundreds of their victims. The Graysons had the winter of 1852-1853 to strategize and get ready for the killing season of the following year. They utilized the period when the trail was mostly deserted to go through the Morrison family's possessions, sorting out what to retain, what to sell, and what to conceal. They also initiated their first dealings with illicit traders in the bigger settlements of Oregon, forging connections with individuals who didn't pry into the history of the items they bought. Brother Ezekiel showed a special talent for this part of their business. His trustworthy appearance and direct way of speaking made his claims of selling items for families who had either gone back east or died from natural causes seem credible. He figured out how to distribute his sales among various towns and to approach specific kinds of purchasers for different types of merchandise. High-quality furniture and domestic goods were sold to affluent settlers wanting to furnish their residences. Tools and agricultural machinery were purchased by pragmatic farmers. Jewelry and valuable metals were passed on to dealers who dealt in such wares. By the spring of 1853, the Graysons had evolved from novice murderers into skilled predators who had a deep knowledge of their trade. They had sorted out the logistical issues of choosing victims, the method of murder, disposing of the bodies, and turning a profit. Crucially, they had also crafted a public image that rendered them almost entirely free from suspicion. With the arrival of spring in 1853, there was a resurgence of activity on the trail, which presented new prospects for the Grayson family's criminal operation. Their next significant achievement occurred in May with their encounter of the Hoffman family. These were German immigrants with a poor command Of English, traveling with a wagon laden with valuable goods, such as finely made tools, high-quality fabrics, and a large quantity of gold coins that constituted their entire savings. In many respects, the Hoffmans were perfect victims. Their difficulty with the language made them reliant on the Graysons for interaction with other travelers. Their unfamiliar traditions made them appear foreign and potentially untrustworthy to other people on the trail, and their evident prosperity made them appealing targets. Furthermore, their basic English skills meant they were less prone to grasp nuanced warnings or to effectively voice any apprehensions to other travelers. Heinrich Hoffmann, the head of the family, was a proficient clockmaker who had brought his instruments and merchandise with the intention of starting a business in Oregon. His wife Greta was expecting their fourth child, and their 3 other children were between the ages of 6 and 12. The Graysons identified another chance to hone their lethal skills when the family's wagon experienced mechanical issues, compelling them to look for assistance near the Sacred Heart Chapel. On this occasion, they tried out varied tactics. Rather than waiting for a family member to fall naturally ill, Sister Constance started giving them small amounts of arsenic right away, presenting it as a prophylactic to fend off trail-related sicknesses. She persuaded the family that the sacred safeguard she was providing would ensure their health while they recuperated. "My goodness," Heinrich uttered in his flawed English, the first time Sister Constance gave him her remedy. "You are exceptionally charitable to people you don't know. The Lord will surely favor you for your assistance." "The Lord has already favored us," Sister Constance answered with well-rehearsed earnestness, "by affording us the chance to aid his followers in their hour of distress." It took almost a full month to carry out the murder of the Hoffman family, but this prolonged period gave the Graysons ample opportunity to meticulously catalog their belongings and formulate comprehensive strategies for selling the valuable clockmaking instruments and merchandise. It also allowed them the time to observe the family's daily habits and interpersonal dynamics, information that would be highly useful in their subsequent endeavors. By the close of 1853, the Graysons had managed to kill 3 whole families, a total of 16 individuals, and had started to view their activities as a commercial venture that demanded the same meticulous forethought and precision as any other successful business. They began to keep accounts, not only of what they took from their victims, but also of their techniques, their errors, and their achievements. These documents, found many years later in concealed sections of the chapel's basement, would ultimately give investigators a chilling insight into the methodical way the Grayson family committed their crimes. The ledgers, written in Father Morai's neat script, held specific records for every family they killed, detailing names, dates, items stolen, how the bodies were disposed of, and the money made from selling the stolen items. The entries were composed in a detached professional tone, reducing human beings to mere stock. A standard entry could state, "Morrison family, 5 individuals deceased, September-October 1852. Belongings consisted of 2 gold pieces, various furniture, and superior tools. Remains buried in Grove Sector C. Approximate earnings of 400 tons. Technique: arsenic administered in medicinal infusions. Time frame: 17 days. Insights gained: lowered the frequency of doses to prolong the process and lessen the chance of being found out. As tales of the Graysons' benevolent deeds circulate, along the trail, they started to draw in victims who were actively looking for their assistance. Families that had learned of the kind Christian individuals offering help to travelers would occasionally make a point of finding the Sacred Heart Chapel, thereby walking straight into the meticulously laid trap of the Graysons. In their second year of operation, the Graysons' systematic method of mass murder saw a considerable evolution. They had discovered from their initial forays that to be successful, they needed more than just efficient killing methods. They also required complex systems to oversee every facet of their lethal operation. Father Morai, with his sharp intellect and leadership qualities, started to manage their activities as though it were a business that simply included murder rather than a string of unconnected killings. The Weatherby family, a test of skill. A significant shift in their approach occurred in the summer of 1854 when they met the Weatherby family from Tennessee. The head of the family, Charles Weatherby was a former officer in the Confederate Army who chose to try his luck in Oregon instead of restoring his plantation, which had been ravaged by war. He was accompanied by his wife Margaret, their 15-year-old twin daughters Sarah and Susan, and Margaret's younger brother, David, a proficient blacksmith who had his entire professional toolkit with him. The Weatherby case stood out not solely because of their affluence, although Charles had converted the bulk of his residual wealth into gold coins and jewels, which he concealed in a specially made section of his wagon. It was also their sharpness and inherent distrust. Having served as a military officer, Charles was accustomed to observing details and evaluating potential dangers. Margaret was a well-read woman who had thoroughly studied the hazards of the trail and was instinctively wary of placing her trust in unfamiliar people. When the Weatherby's wagon experienced two ruble with its wheels near the chapel, Charles at first turned down the Graysons' help. He was aware of tales of travelers who had taken assistance from strangers and had then disappeared. The remoteness of the location and the very timely arrival of Brother Ezekiel also made him feel suspicious. "I am grateful for your Christian kindness," Charles expressed to Father Morai at their initial encounter. "But we possess the necessary abilities and equipment to manage our own repairs. We intend to leave promptly." Father Morai, however, had grown adept at interpreting individuals and modifying his strategy as needed. He chose not to insist, but instead pulled back with grace, mentioning offhandedly that Sister Constance had reported seeing indications of illness in the vicinity, perhaps cholera or dysentery. He suggested that the family might want to think about delaying their departure until they were sure none of them had been exposed. "Naturally, Brother Charles," Morai stated with seeming empathy. "A sensible man ensures his family's safety. However, I would feel I had failed in my Christian obligation if I did not let you know that Sister Constance has been attending to a number of trail fever cases in recent weeks. The signs can be slow to appear, and to travel while contagious can both spread the illness and compromise the body's ability to fight it off." The reference to sickness had precisely the outcome Morai had hoped for. Margaret Weatherby, who was already worn out from months on the trail and anxious about her daughter's welfare, started to have second thoughts about their hasty exit. The family's resolve broke when young David came down with a slight temperature the following day, a temperature that Sister Constance asserted was a preliminary sign of the local ailment. "Maybe," Margaret proposed to her spouse, "we ought to take them up on their offer of lodging, just until we can be sure that David's condition isn't severe." Charles reluctantly consented. However, his background in the military kept him on a high state of alert, which presented a problem for the Graysons. In contrast to their earlier victims, who had been in dire need and full of gratitude, Charles scrutinized everything with a keen eye and posed sharp inquiries about the family's history and what had become of other travelers who had come to them for aid. The Graysons adjusted by feeding him meticulously fabricated tales of their successful care of past families. They took him to the chapel's graveyard, indicating graves they asserted were of travelers who were already on their deathbeds upon arrival and had been given a formal Christian interment. They even presented him with letters of appreciation, forged documents purportedly from grateful families who had made a full recovery from grave illnesses and had safely reached their destinations. "Brother Charles," Father Morai remarked one evening as they were seated on the chapel's veranda, "I see why you are wary. A man who has served in the military learns to be selective with his trust. But think about this. If we had malicious intentions, wouldn't we have already acted? Wouldn't we have chosen less formidable targets than a trained soldier who is armed and vigilant?" The mental persuasion was nuanced yet powerful. By recognizing Charles's distrust and military past, Morai made him feel esteemed and clever. By suggesting that he would be a challenging victim, the minister made the notion of being a target seem more improbable. Above all, by projecting an image of sincerity and transparency, he steadily eroded Charles's caution. The actual killings of the Weatherby family took almost a month and a half, which was the longest duration the Graysons had ever attempted for such a task. Sister Constance initiated the process by giving them very low doses of arsenic in water she asserted had been sanctified for healing and was advised for warding off illness. The amounts were so minute that the symptoms appeared very slowly, resembling a natural sickness rather than a poisoning. David, being the youngest and physically most fragile member of the family, was the first to die. His death appeared to validate Sister Constance's admonitions about the local sickness, and the family's appreciation for her attentiveness during his last days deepened their confidence in her medical skills. Margaret was the next to fall ill, with symptoms that Sister Constance claimed were due to the fatigue of caring for David during his sickness. Charles, with his training in analyzing situations on the battlefield, started to see troubling correlations. The fact that he and his daughter stayed healthy while the others got sicker, the strange nature of their symptoms, and the Graysons' constant presence during the most critical moments of each family member's illness all fed into a mounting sense of foreboding. His doubts peaked when he found Brother Ezekiel going through the items in his wagon late one evening. When questioned, Ezekiel stated that he was just making sure their belongings were safe and that no wild animals had gotten to their food. The reason seemed plausible, but Charles's intuition suggested something else was afoot. "Margaret," he confided to his ailing wife the next day, "I have a feeling we should get out of here. There's something not quite right about this place." However, Margaret was too frail to make the journey, and attempting to move her would probably have been fatal. Charles felt caught between his escalating doubts and his affection for his family. He was unable to desert his dying wife, yet he couldn't get rid of the feeling that remaining would be the end of them all. The situation was resolved when Charles made a finding that validated his deepest anxieties. As he was looking for medical provisions in the chapel's basement, he came across a hidden section filled with belongings that were unmistakably from other travelers, items too intimate and too precious to have been left behind by choice. Amidst the concealed items, he discovered a child's doll that looked as if it had been recently used, a pocket watch with an unfamiliar name engraved on it, and, most conclusively, a letter intended for someone in Oregon City with a recent date which had clearly never been mailed. The letter, penned in a woman's script, detailed her safe arrival at a chapel and expressed gratitude to God for the benevolence of a Christian family who were looking after her unwell children. Charles understood that he had found proof of earlier killings and that his own family was being methodically poisoned by the very individuals who professed to be their saviors. However, his insight arrived too late. That night, Margaret passed away, and when he woke the next morning, he felt the same symptoms that had come before the death of each of his family members. What Charles was unaware of was that the Graysons had been observing him closely, had seen his increasing doubts, and had chosen to speed up his poisoning before he could take any action based on his fears. Father Morai had put a substantial amount of arsenic in Charles's supper, guaranteeing that the ex-soldier would be too feeble to be a danger. As Charles was on his deathbed, with his twin daughters beside him, he made a frantic effort to alert them to the Graysons' genuine character. However, his statements were brushed off as the delirious talk of a man with a high fever, and the girls kept their faith in the people who were gradually killing them. The Graysons learned several key lessons from the Weatherby incident. Firstly, they realized that dealing with intelligent and wary victims necessitated more refined methods of persuasion. Secondly, they found that although it was more hazardous, prolonging the duration of the murder made their actions more credible and lucrative. Thirdly, they understood the need for improved ways to identify and handle victims who started to doubt their intentions. Most significantly, the incident showed that even well-trained, sharp individuals could be successfully misled and killed if the appropriate psychological tactics were used with enough time and expertise. This understanding emboldened the Graysons to go after progressively richer and more notable families, confident that their techniques could outwit even the most cautious and distrustful travelers. The finding of evidence from past killings in the chapel's basement also prompted them to enhance their methods for disposing of evidence. They started to incinerate personal belongings that could link them to their victims, melt down jewelry and precious metals to remove any distinguishing features, and devise more elaborate hiding spots for items they planned to either keep or sell at a later time. By the close of 1854, the Graysons had killed 23 individuals from 7 families, and their activities had grown into a complex criminal operation that brought in large sums of money while being kept completely secret. They had also begun to perceive themselves not as lawbreakers, but as agents of a higher power, who were being compensated for their work by being permitted to benefit from the belongings of their victims. The survivor. Catherine Patterson. In the year 1855, the Graysons' murderous activities reached a pivotal moment when they faced their first significant obstacle, an intended victim who managed to survive and had seen enough to bring down their whole operation. The event started in a familiar way with the arrival of the Patterson family from Ohio, but it concluded with the Graysons confronting the frightening prospect of being discovered and having to make urgent decisions about their future. Thomas Patterson was a prosperous businessman who had sold his Ohio company to explore opportunities in the expanding economy of Oregon. He was traveling with his wife Emily, their 4 children, aged between 8 and 16, and Emily's sister Catherine, a single woman in her 30s who acted as the family's educator and guardian. The Patterson family was especially appealing to the Graysons, not only for their evident affluence. Thomas had turned his company's worth into easily carried gold and cash, but also for their seeming decency and the high chance that their vanishing would ultimately be noted by business partners in both Ohio and Oregon. The family's wagon party had broken up near the Blue Mountains, and they were journeying by themselves when they met Brother Ezekiel about 5 miles from the Sacred Heart Chapel. Their wagon was not damaged, and no one in the family appeared to be sick. However, Ezekiel had mastered the art of manufacturing situations rather than just passively waiting for them to arise. "A good afternoon to you, brother," Ezekiel hailed as he neared the Pattersons' wagon. "I just had to comment on your excellent team of oxen. That's some high-quality cattle you've got there. Would you folks by any chance be open to a trade for some new provisions? We have a fine selection at the chapel just up the road." Thomas Patterson was an astute businessman who had learned to assess propositions with care before committing. He was intrigued by the idea of getting new provisions, but there was something in Ezekiel's demeanor, perhaps a bit too affable, too keen, that made him wary. "We are grateful for your proposal," Thomas answered. "However, we have ample supplies for the rest of our trip. We plan to proceed without delay." Ezekiel, however, was ready for such a reply. Indeed, but I was thinking I might point out something that could spare your family a great deal of difficulty. Sister Constance, our woman of medicine, has been attending to a number of mountain fever cases in the last few weeks. It's a dreadful illness that develops slowly, and by the time people discover they are unwell, they are too feeble to continue their journey in safety. The reference to illness had the desired impact on Emily Patterson, who instantly started to fret about the well-being of her children. "Mountain fever?" she inquired. "We've had no news of any sickness in this region." "Well, ma'am," Ezekiel responded with feigned solicitude, "it's not a topic that people are keen to discuss. It's detrimental to business, if you catch my drift. But Sister Constance, she possesses remedies that can prevent it, provided they are taken before any symptoms manifest. It could be beneficial for you to visit the chapel just to have your family checked." Thomas was still doubtful, but Emily's motherly concern had been triggered. The thought that her children could be vulnerable to a perilous disease without her being aware was horrifying, and the chance to prevent it was too significant to pass up. "Thomas," she murmured, "maybe we should at least consult with this woman of medicine. If there is an illness in the area, isn't it wise for us to be cautious?" Thomas reluctantly consented to go to the chapel, assuring himself that their only purpose was to gather information about this supposed illness before resuming their travels. He couldn't have known that this choice would result in the most terrifying ordeal of his life and the almost complete annihilation of his family. The Graysons welcomed the Patterson family with their customary blend of Christian affability and artful persuasion. Thomas was taken with Father Morai's business acumen and seeming knowledge of Oregon's economic landscape. Emily was captivated by Sister Constance's key and demeanor and her clear fondness for children. The Patterson children were amused by Brother Ezekiel's tales of frontier existence and his displays of various hands-on abilities. In just a few hours after their arrival, the family had consented to stay the night at the chapel so that Sister Constance could check everyone for indications of mountain fever. The checkup, as expected, indicated that a number of family members were displaying preliminary signs that needed prompt attention with Sister Constance's preventative concoctions. The first to get the treatment was Catherine Patterson, Emily's sister. Being a single woman with no children, she had dedicated her life to looking after her sister's family and was especially anxious about the children's welfare. She readily drank Sister Constance's potion and urged the others to follow suit. However, Catherine was also the sharpest observer in the family, possessing a keen analytical mind that picked up on details others might overlook. On the second evening of their visit, she noticed Brother Ezekiel conducting what seemed to be a meticulous check of the items in their wagon. When she brought this to Sister Constance's attention, the older woman brushed it off as a standard precaution for their safety. Brother Ezekiel inspects the belongings of all our visitors, Sister Constance clarified. We have encountered issues with robbery before, and we are committed to making sure nothing is lost while families are in our charge. The reason given sounded plausible, but Catherine kept noticing minor things that bothered her. The way Father Morai's gaze would linger on Thomas's gold timepiece. The fact that Sister Constance always mixed her remedies in seclusion, never permitting anyone to watch. The strange pattern where every family member who got a treatment seemed to come down with symptoms that then needed more treatment. Catherine's doubts reached a tipping point on the fourth day when she saw Sister Constance putting a white substance into the medicine meant for young Timothy Patterson, the family's watch by Angest. When Catherine inquired about the substance, Sister Constance said it was holy salt that improved the healing effects of the herbs, but Catherine had been raised in Ohio, where her father was a chemist, and she knew that the crystalline look of the substance was not like regular salt. More significantly, she saw that Sister Constance grew flustered and guarded when asked about her methods, a stark contrast to her usual calm self-assurance. That night, Catherine made a choice that would be the salvation of her life and the lives of her remaining family. Rather than consuming her prescribed potion, she feigned drinking it and instead spat it into a cloth. She also managed to persuade young Timothy to do the same, framing it as a fun secret game. The consequences were startling and horrifying. As Thomas, Emily, and the 3 elder children grew progressively weaker from their medications, Catherine and Timothy stayed in good health. More importantly, Catherine started to realize that the family members who were most ill were the ones who had most dutifully followed Sister Constance's medical instructions. By the 6th day, 2 of the Pattersons' children were dead, and it was evident that Thomas was also dying. Emily, although frail, was still lucid and able enough for a conversation with her sister. It was in this conversation that Catherine decided to voice her fears. "Emily," she said in a low voice, "I believe these individuals are poisoning us. I believe they are responsible for the deaths in our family." Emily's first response was one of disbelief and rage. The notion that the kind Christian family who had been looking after them could be murderers seemed utterly incredible. However, as Catherine detailed her observations and the progression of the symptoms, Emily started to grasp the dreadful reality. "What are our options?" Emily inquired. "Thomas is on his deathbed. The children are dying, and we lack the strength to go anywhere." Catherine had been anticipating this query. "We must escape from this place, even at the risk of our lives. To remain here is a certain death sentence, and we must bring Timothy. He is the only other one who has not been taking the medicine." The escape strategy Catherine came up with was fraught with danger and desperation, yet it was their sole hope for survival. She bided her time until the very early morning, when the Graysons were sound asleep, and then assisted Emily and Timothy in quietly leaving the cabin. Thomas was too feeble to be moved, and the older children were unconscious, but Catherine made the heart-wrenching choice to leave them, rather than endanger the lives of those who could still be rescued. The 3 survivors reached the family wagon, where Catherine had stashed some of their gold and crucial provisions. However, just as they were about to depart, they detected the sound of footsteps coming from the chapel. Father Morai, seemingly awakened by a noise, was on his way to see what was happening. "Hurry," Catherine whispered. "Get under the canvas in the wagon bed. Whatever you do, don't make a sound." When Father Morai discovered Catherine by the side of the wagon, his expression validated her deepest anxieties. He didn't show the expected concern for a family member who might be sleepwalking or disoriented from sickness. Instead, his face was cold and calculating. "Sister Catherine," he uttered in a low voice, "you ought to be in bed. The mountain fever can lead to disorientation and flawed reasoning." "I was unable to sleep," Catherine answered, striving to maintain a steady voice. "I was anxious about Thomas and the children." Morai observed her for a considerable time, and Catherine understood that he was trying to determine if she had uncovered their secret. The air between them was thick with tension, each anticipating the other's next move. "It might be," Morai suggested at last, "that Sister Constance should mix a more potent concoction for you, something to ensure a more restful sleep." Catherine knew he was suggesting he would kill her right then, rather than letting the slow poison do its work. "That is very kind of you," she responded, "but I believe I will first attempt to fall asleep on my own." "I'm sorry, but I have to insist," Morai retorted, and his hand reached for something hidden in his coat. The events that followed would stay with Catherine Patterson for the rest of her days. As Morai moved towards her, seemingly to drag her back to the cabin, Emily Patterson appeared from the other side of the wagon. Though weakened by the poison, she had found the strength to arm herself with Thomas's handgun. "Get away from my sister," Emily commanded, her voice frail yet resolute. Morai shifted his attention to this new danger. In that brief moment of his inattention, Catherine seized a hefty iron implement from the wagon and hit him on the head. The strike was not lethal, but it dazed him sufficiently for the two women and the boy to make their frantic getaway. The wagon was pulling away from the Sacred Heart Chapel just as Brother Ezekiel came out of the main house, drawn by the disturbance. The final image Catherine had as they escaped was of Ezekiel dashing towards the cabin, where the remainder of their family lay dying, likely to complete the job the poison had begun. The journey of their escape was a harrowing ordeal filled with terror, weariness, and sorrow. Emily, debilitated by weeks of being poisoned, could barely stay awake, which meant Catherine had to manage the wagon, look after Timothy, and be on the lookout for anyone following them. They had no definite destination, only the urgent realization that they needed to find help before the Graysons could overtake them, or the poison took Emily's life. For 3 days they navigated through unknown lands, taking what seemed to be old hunting paths and praying they would come across other travelers or a settlement. Timothy, deeply affected by the loss of his family and the frightening escape, hardly said a word. Emily's consciousness would fade in and out, and at times she would cry out for her deceased children and husband. On the 4th day, they came across a military patrol from Fort Dallas, composed of soldiers who were in the area to investigate reports of Native American movements. The leader of the patrol at first thought Catherine's incredible tale of murder and poisoning at the Sacred Heart Chapel was the product of a mind delirious from sickness or shock. However, Catherine had brought along proof: a small bottle of Sister Constance's medicine she had kept, bits of the white substance she had seen being mixed into the remedies, and a number of items from their wagon that she had noticed Brother Ezekiel scrutinizing with suspicion. Crucially, she had Emily to back up her story. And even though Emily could barely speak, her symptoms were in line with arsenic poisoning. The manhunt and discovery of a wider conspiracy. The subsequent military inquiry would bring to light the full magnitude of the Graysons' offenses, but it would also show that the 3 family members had managed to escape with no time to spare. Upon the soldiers' arrival at the Sacred Heart Chapel, they discovered Thomas Patterson and his 3 senior children deceased, their bodies exhibiting definite evidence of arsenic poisoning. The Graysons themselves were gone, having taken with them the majority of the stolen goods that were concealed in the chapel's basement. The unearthing of the basement's hidden storage gave investigators their initial insight into the methodical nature of the Graysons' killings. Secret sections held the belongings of numerous families, all meticulously arranged and recorded. The most stunning discovery was the comprehensive logs kept by Father Morai, which chronicle at each family's murder with the dispassionate accuracy of a financial account. These logs indicated that the Patterson family was the Graysons' 37th planned group of victims, and in a span of under 3 years, they had taken the lives of more than 150 individuals. The records detailed not only the killings, but also the money made from the sale of stolen items and the insights gained from every successful operation. The survival and statement of Catherine Patterson signaled the beginning of the downfall for the Grayson family's criminal operation. Yet it would be years before the authorities could grasp the full extent of their deeds and apprehend the culprits. In the meantime, the revelation that such malevolence could be masked by a show of Christian benevolence created a stir in the communities along the trail and permanently altered the way travelers viewed strangers who offered them aid. The psychological toll on the 3 survivors was profound and lasting. Emily Patterson was never able to completely overcome the effects of the arsenic poisoning and passed away within a year of their escape, as her body was too ravaged by the poisonous substances to continue living. Timothy grew into a man, marked by the emotional wounds of his youth, forever unable to place his trust in religious figures and tormented by recurring nightmares of the chapel and the deaths of his relatives. Catherine Patterson developed an unwavering determination to unmask the Graysons and see that they were held accountable for their actions. She gave statements to military investigators, officials of the territory, and eventually to federal marshals, establishing herself as the key witness whose survival made a conviction feasible. Her clear memories of the family's tactics and the specifics of their hidden logs would be vital in grasping the entire scope of their criminal activities. However, the Graysons had not been inactive after their escape from the Sacred Heart Chapel, drawing on their extensive experience in erasing their past and, with the considerable funds they had gathered from their victims, they were ready for the eventuality of being found out and had backup plans to carry on their activities in different places. The search for the Grayson family officially started in the autumn of 1855. But the fugitives had a number of key benefits that enabled them to avoid being caught for almost 2 years. They had an in-depth familiarity with isolated regions throughout the Oregon Territory, significant financial assets from their long history of murder and robbery, and, most importantly, the skill to assume new identities and integrate into communities where their history was not known. The investigation was led by Federal Marshal William Harris, who found himself dealing with a situation unlike any he had faced before. The Graysons were not your typical criminals who had committed a single offense and then run. They were methodical murderers who had been successfully operating for years by taking advantage of their victims' trust and helplessness. Their pretense of being religious had been so persuasive that many who had met them found it impossible to believe they were murderers. These are not desperate individuals who killed in a burst of emotion, Marshal Harris noted in his formal account. They are methodical predators who transformed murder into a commercial venture. They are skilled at twisting people's faith and goodwill for their own wicked ends, and they possess the means and cleverness to start over whenever it becomes necessary. A significant development in the case occurred in the spring of 1857, when officials in California flagged unusual goings-on at an isolated mission near the border with Oregon. The Mission of Divine Mercy had sprung up unexpectedly in a spot that gave it access to several wagon routes, and there were reports that travelers who had sought help there were vanishing in mysterious ways. The mission was run by a man who called himself Father Benedict Morrison, along with his 2 helpers, Sister Mary Morrison and Brother Thomas Morrison. To a casual observer, they looked like a devout religious family offering help to travelers in distress. However, Marshal Harris saw the same pattern of operation that Catherine Patterson had described, and that was supported by the evidence discovered at the Sacred Heart Chapel. The mission's site had been deliberately selected to catch families on their way between Oregon and California, groups that were frequently alone, weary, and open to offers of help. The structure itself was bigger than the original chapel, featuring larger basement spaces and several additional buildings that could be used for various tasks in a murder and robbery scheme. Most crucially, authorities in Northern California had gotten reports of missing families that fit the Graysons' typical victim description. Well-off families, traveling by themselves or in small clusters, would ask for assistance at the mission and then just disappear, with no indication of where they were headed or where they might be. Marshal Harris put together a group of federal officers and soldiers to look into the mission, but he was resolved not to make the same error that had let the Graysons get away from the Sacred Heart Chapel. This time, the plan of action would be meticulously devised and carried out to stop the suspects from escaping or getting rid of evidence. For a number of weeks, the investigation team observed the mission from hidden vantage points in the nearby hills. Their observations confirmed their gravest fears. The Morrison family was, in fact, the Graysons, and they had not only restarted their murderous ways but had also refined their techniques based on what they had learned before. During this period of observation, the agents saw the arrival of the Henderson family from Missouri, a well-to-do farming family with 4 children on their way to California to start a new farm. The family's wagon was filled with agricultural tools, domestic items, and what looked to be a considerable amount of money. The Graysons' handling of the Henderson family mirrored their usual method with chilling accuracy. Father Morai, who now went by the name Father Benedict, welcomed the family with seeming kindness and immediately started to gauge their financial standing and susceptibility. Sister Constance, who was now known as Sister Mary, quickly singled out the family members who were most likely to fall for her medical deceptions. Brother Ezekiel, now called Brother Thomas, began to assess their belongings and means of travel. However, the surveillance team also noted fresh aspects of the Graysons' operation that showed how their tactics had advanced. They had brought in several accomplices, local men who pretended to be legitimate merchants and guides, but were actually acting as lookouts and helpers in the murders. They had also created more complex ways of getting rid of bodies and hiding evidence. Most horrifyingly, the agents saw the Graysons trying out different strategies for family extermination. Instead of just using slow-acting arsenic poisoning, they were testing quicker methods that could wipe out whole families in a matter of days instead of weeks. It seemed they had decided that their previous, slower approach was too dangerous and that faster killings would be less likely to draw notice. Marshal Harris was in a dreadful predicament as he observed the Henderson family being ensnared by the Graysons. To step in right away might rescue the Hendersons, but it would also give the Graysons a chance to flee once more, possibly to restart their activities somewhere else. To hold off for additional evidence could furnish the necessary proof for a conviction, but it would almost certainly lead to the deaths of innocent individuals. The choice was made for him when one of his men saw Brother Ezekiel give what seemed to be a substantial dose of poison to the youngest Henderson child. The boy, who had been perfectly healthy and energetic that morning, suddenly became extremely ill after consuming milk that Ezekiel had brought to him himself. "We're going in now," Chris instructed his men. "We cannot allow another family to be killed while we stand by collecting proof." The assault on the mission of Divine Mercy took place at sunrise on June 15, 1857, almost 2 years following the Graysons' flight from the Sacred Heart Chapel. Federal officers and military troops encircled the area while the family was still in bed, ensuring there was no chance of escape or destruction of evidence. What they discovered within the mission's buildings was even more horrific than they had imagined. The basement held the belongings of at least 20 families, a number far greater than could have been gathered in the short time the Graysons had been at this site. Secret compartments yielded detailed logs of murders that had taken place not only in Oregon and California, but also in other territories where the family had apparently been active before setting up their base in Oregon. The logs depicted a criminal operation that had lasted for over 10 years and crossed multiple state lines. The Graysons had been killing travelers and taking their belongings since at least 1845, shifting their location as needed and leaving a trail of death that was only now beginning to be understood by investigators. The journals of Father Morai contained passages that showed the psychological progression of the family's criminal behavior. Initial entries indicated some sense of wrongdoing and a need to justify their actions on religious grounds, with Morai persuading himself that he was showing compassion to afflicted travelers and being blessed by God for his charitable deeds. However, later entries revealed a total disregard for any ethical principles. The killings were documented solely in relation to profit and effectiveness, with thorough examinations of which techniques yielded the most favorable outcomes and which kinds of victims were most lucrative. The journals were like the financial statements of a highly profitable company, where human lives were treated as mere assets and murder was a standard part of business. Most unsettling were the sections detailing the family's intentions for the future. Morai had been devising strategies to broaden their enterprise to encompass several sites, with various family members managing distinct murder locations along different travel paths. He had also been exploring methods for killing larger numbers of people at once, seemingly driven by the perceived slowness of killing families individually. The rescue of the Henderson family, while the poisoning was still in its initial phases, gave investigators the chance to save their lives and get direct accounts of the Graysons' methods. The head of the family, James Henderson, gave a thorough description of how his family was deceived and how the poisoning was made to look like medical aid. They appeared to be divine messengers, Henderson recounted to the investigators. Sister Mary was so kind to our children, so skilled in treating illnesses. Father Benedict spoke with such conviction about the scriptures and the will of God. If anyone had suggested they were murderers, I would have dismissed them as insane. The methods of psychological persuasion used by the Graysons were complex enough to fool intelligent, well-informed individuals who had been explicitly cautioned about the risks of trusting strangers on the trail. Their religious standing, coupled with their seeming medical expertise and acts of genuine kindness, wove a disguise that was almost unbreakable until it was too late. When she was finally interrogated by the authorities, Sister Constance displayed no regret for her involvement in the murders. Instead, she was incensed at being stopped from finishing her medical procedures and maintained that the families they had killed were in a better state dead than if they had to keep enduring the hardships of trail sicknesses. Those individuals were on their way out regardless, she stated to Marshal Hendricks during her questioning. We offered them solace in their last moments and made sure their belongings were used to further God's mission instead of being squandered. We extended a kindness they would not have otherwise found. Throughout the questioning, Brother Ezekiel remained silent, declining to share any details about their operations or to voice any thoughts on their offenses. His demeanor indicated that he saw himself as a loyal subordinate who had merely followed instructions without considering their ethical rightness. Father Morai, on the other hand, revealed a completely different side of himself when faced with the proof of his offenses. The charismatic, commanding minister vanished, and in his place was a detached, calculating murderer who was unmoved by the accounts of survivors or the evidence of his victims' pain. You people fail to grasp our achievement, he declared to the investigators. We got rid of the frail and the sick. We took wealth from those unable to defend it and gave it to those who could make better use of it, and we offered spiritual solace to individuals who were destined for dreadful deaths anyway. We were agents of both natural order and divine command. The magnitude of the Graysons' offenses grew as investigators examined their logs and linked them to unresolved disappearances across the Western Territories. A pattern began to emerge from families that had vanished without a trace, solitary graves found by subsequent travelers, and accounts of enigmatic illnesses at isolated religious outposts, all of which suggested the Graysons' culpability. By the conclusion of the investigation, authorities had tied the family to the killings of over 800 individuals in various states and territories. The real count was probably greater, as a large number of their victims were nomadic families whose disappearances were never formally documented or looked into. The legal proceedings against the Grayson family commenced in September 1857 and swiftly became one of the most widely followed criminal cases in the history of the American frontier. The prosecuting team, headed by Territorial Attorney General Samuel Morrison, was confronted with the task of proving crimes that had been meticulously hidden and whose victims were no longer able to speak for themselves. The prosecution's case hinged on the detailed records Father Morai had maintained throughout their life of crime. These journals offered comprehensive narratives of specific killings, the techniques employed, the items stolen, and the money gained. Being in Morai's own script and filled with details that only the culprits could know, the records acted as undeniable confessions that could not be challenged or explained away. The testimony of Catherine Patterson was essential for understanding the method of the murders and how the family had managed to so successfully mislead their victims. Her story of survival illustrated both the methodical nature of the Graysons' tactics and the psychological persuasion they used to keep their victims under control. The Henderson family's account demonstrated that the Graysons had persisted with and improved their murderous ways even after they had fled the Sacred Heart Chapel. Their description of the attempted killings at the Mission of Divine Mercy established that the family had taken lessons from their past errors and had devised even more effective means of quickly exterminating entire families. What was perhaps most detrimental to the defense was the material evidence discovered at both the Sacred Heart Chapel and the Mission of Divine Mercy. Investigators had found not only the belongings of murdered families but also the instruments and materials used for the poisonings, precise maps indicating the sites of unmarked graves, and letters to and from illicit dealers who had bought the stolen items. The lawyers for the defense tried to contend that the family had been offering legitimate medical help to unwell travelers and that the deaths were due to illnesses caught on the trail, not intentional poisoning. They proposed that the presence of other families' possessions could be accounted for by lawful purchases or bequests from appreciative patients who had passed away despite their efforts. However, the prosecution successfully showed that the frequency of deaths at places run by the Graysons was statistically improbable unless deliberate murder had occurred. Testimony from medical experts verified that the symptoms reported by survivors were in line with arsenic poisoning, not with common trail sicknesses. Crucially, the family's own logs explicitly detailed their actions as murder for financial gain rather than medical assistance given out of charity. The trial went on for 6 weeks and captured the nation's interest, with newspapers all over the country covering the story of the systematic killing of trail families by individuals who were pretending to be Christian missionaries. The case brought to light the precariousness of westward migrants and the simplicity with which predators could take advantage of the trust and helplessness of families looking for aid in remote places. Father Morai Grayson was found guilty on multiple counts of murder and was condemned to be executed by hanging. Sister Constance Grayson was also found guilty of murder and was given a sentence of life in prison, which made her one of the all women in the history of the American frontier to be handed such a harsh punishment for a criminal act. Brother Ezekiel Grayson was found guilty of being an accomplice to murder and was sentenced to 20 years in the territorial penitentiary. The executions and imprisonments of the Grayson family signaled the conclusion of one of the most dreadful criminal operations in the history of the American frontier. However, the effects of their deeds reached much further than the direct victims and their kin. The case fundamentally altered the way travelers viewed offers of assistance from strangers and resulted in more military patrols on the main travel routes. Religious groups all over the frontier territories had to face the fact that their beliefs and charitable inclinations could be misused by predators who knew how to twist Christian goodwill for their own wicked ends. A great number of authentic missionaries and religious workers discovered that their attempts to aid travelers were now viewed with distrust and apprehension, as people found it hard to tell the difference between sincere acts of charity and possible criminal intent. The Graysons' offenses also highlighted major flaws in the law enforcement and communication networks of the frontier. The family had managed to conduct their operations for over 10 years without being caught, largely because there was no efficient method for authorities in various territories to exchange information regarding suspicious goings-on or individuals who had gone missing. The case prompted enhancements in communication between territories and the creation of more organized methods for looking into reports of missing people. Catherine Patterson, the survivor whose account was vital to the conviction, never fully healed from the harrowing ordeal she endured with the Grayson family. She dedicated the rest of her life to championing better safeguards for travelers and collaborating with law enforcement to spot and probe suspicious conduct at isolated religious establishments. Her nephew Timothy, the young boy who had survived the family's attempt on his life, grew up with deep psychological wounds that shaped his entire existence. He remained unmarried, had no children, and worked as a frontier guide in his adult years, assisting other families in avoiding the kind of dangers that had annihilated his own. The locations where the Graysons had conducted their activities were deserted and later demolished by the local populace, who wished to erase every sign of the dreadful crimes that had taken place there. The Sacred Heart Chapel was razed by fire in 1858, and the Mission of Divine Mercy was taken apart, with its components repurposed for new building projects. However, the psychological scar of the Graysons' deeds persisted for many years. Families all over the Western territories would recount tales of the deceitful missionaries who had killed hundreds of blameless individuals, using these stories as cautionary tales about the risks of placing trust in strangers who offered assistance on remote paths. The case also brought up unsettling inquiries into the essence of wickedness and the potential for regular individuals to carry out exceptional offenses. Father Morai, Sister Constance, and Brother Ezekiel were not individuals who were clearly mentally unstable or outwardly threatening. They were sharp, well-spoken people who had successfully masqueraded as benevolent Christians for over 10 years. Their capacity to keep up their pretense while methodically killing innocent families called into question basic beliefs about human character and the trustworthiness of religious figures. The case showed that evil could be systematic, well-planned, and carried on for extended periods by individuals who seemed to be respected members of society. What was perhaps most troubling was the understanding that the Graysons truly felt their deeds were defensible and had persuaded themselves that they were rendering a service by getting rid of feeble and ailing travelers and reallocating their belongings to more worthy individuals. Their sense of moral superiority and absence of guilt pointed to a type of ethical decay that was far more perilous than mere avarice or need. The heritage of the Grayson family's murders stands as a testament that the American frontier was defined not only by the bravery and resolve of upright pioneers, but also by the predators who aimed to misuse their helplessness and confidence. The 800 individuals who lost their lives at the hands of these sham missionaries mark a grim period in the narrative of westward movement, a period that lays bare the entire spectrum of human potential for both virtue and malevolence. Their tale is a powerful reminder of the need for watchfulness, the perils of unquestioning faith, and the dreadful cost that blameless people can incur when malevolence cloaks itself in the guise of virtue. Ultimately, the Graysons' offenses serve as a warning that the most dangerous predators are frequently those who have a precise understanding of how to use our most admirable qualities for their own sinister designs. Final thoughts. More than 150 years after the Graysons were brought to justice, their tale still lingers in the shared history of the American West. The families they shattered, the confidence they violated, and the lives they prematurely ended stand as enduring warnings that malevolence can take root wherever human weakness and need provide a chance for misuse. The bravery of survivors such as Catherine Patterson, who risked everything to bring the truth to light and obtain justice for the deceased, offers a stark contrast to the darkness of the Graysons' legacy. Her account not only led to the conviction of the murderers, but also prevented countless future deaths by making both the author, IDs, and the general public aware of the threat posed by predators who hid their criminal actions behind the cloak of religious authority. By recalling the crimes of the Grayson family, we pay tribute not only to the victims who perished, but also to the survivors who mustered the resilience to oppose evil and see that justice was ultimately achieved. Their narrative serves as a reminder that even in the most grim moments of human history, there will always be individuals who champion the truth and resist letting evil win without a fight. What is your take on this frightening story from America's frontier history? Does it alter your perception of the idealized tales of westward migration? The methodical misuse of Christian kindness by the Grayson family exposes the most sinister facets of human character and the heavy toll of betrayed trust. If this narrative has sent shivers down your spine and prompted you to contemplate the concealed hazards that lay in wait on the frontier paths, please pass it on to someone who enjoys grim historical enigmas. Click the like button to show your appreciation for content that exposes these overlooked atrocities, and subscribe to ensure you don't miss any of the unsettling realities that have defined America's history. The next time you come across accounts of the valiant pioneers who tamed the American West, don't forget that they also had to fend off predators like the Graysons, people who made murder a family trade and concealed their wickedness with a mask of religious piety.